Within 3 weeks, the multiplying cells have curled into a quivering oval ball. Inside lies a cluster of cells that have begun to fold themselves into the shape of a garden hose, the neural tube. From the bottom will come the spinal cord. From the top, the brain. Here lies the primitive beginning of all our thoughts and feelings. By 4 weeks, just as a woman is discovering she is pregnant, the first brain cells, the neurons, are already forming at an astonishing rate. 500,000 neurons every minute. Neurons that will never reproduce themselves and rarely be replaced.
And that's amazing, because if you think about it, most cells in your body turn over. If you think about your skin, you're constantly, it's sort of disgusting, you're constantly sloughing off dead skin cells. And someone calculated once that if you look at the turnover of skin across a lifetime, you're probably generating and shedding about 90 pounds of skin. So most cells in the body do their thing, and then they die and they're replaced. Neurons are born in fetal life, and then those very cells are the ones that are still functioning all the way into old age.
As the tiny fetus grows, the neurons make their way out from inside the neural tube to build the brain, layer upon layer, like an onion. The neurons follow a cellular pathway, as if they were traveling down a highway. They just grab hold of supporting cells called glia and propel themselves along.
They put their nucleus in the back of the cell, which makes them sort of fat in the back, and then they hold on to the guide wire, this glial fiber. So it's kind of like an inchworm as it moves along. And each little cell goes all by itself in what is a very, very vulnerable process. No other kind of cell has to do that, and it's just an amazing thing.
Neurons travel in waves, millions every day, embarking on a daunting expedition that scientists call migration.
It's an amazing phenomenon because it's as if they're going across the country. I mean, in terms of the distances relative to their size, they're making a huge odyssey through all kinds of foreign territory. And the most amazing thing about this migration is that they generally do it without mistakes. They're following cues along the way that are telling them exactly where to go.
For years, scientists wondered how the migrating neurons find their place in the brain. Do the neurons simply travel in herds, gliding down a glial highway which takes them to their final destination? Or do neurons do their own driving? Each neuron genetically programmed to fulfill its own predetermined purpose.
We used to think that migration was just like delivering cells out a conveyor belt, and you just dump out the cells at the end. But now we know that's not the case. There's evidence that shows that young neurons have an idea about where they're migrating to, and that they can recognize their position within the brain.
In her laboratory at Stanford University, neurobiologist Susan McConnell devised a series of experiments to track the destiny of a migrating neuron. Neurons are born from the division of stem cells, the seeds from which the tissues of the body grow. Some stem cells can transform themselves into any kind of cell: blood, skin, heart, bone, or brain cell. McConnell took a descendant of a stem cell and, before it morphed into a neuron, transplanted it into a developing brain. Then watched it migrate. She found that the fate of the soon-to-become neuron was determined by the neurons that were its neighbors. It traveled beside them and took on the same function they did.
That cell is plastic. It's still listening to signals from the outside. It gets the instructions from the new neighbors, and it resets its fate. It says, yeah, sure, I can do that too.
But when McConnell transplanted a neuron, it was true to its own genetic destiny. It followed its own path and took on an entirely different function from the cells surrounding it.
What this result tells us is that by the time a young neuron begins its migration, it has already received instructions about what to become. It knows. It goes into a new environment, and even though everyone else in the brain, all these other young neurons, are going to position A, it says, no, I'm supposed to go to position B, and that's exactly what it does.
By 24 weeks, the vital organs of the fetus are well formed. The primitive heart can beat on its own. The once powerless lungs are now prepared to fill with air. And the brain has nearly its full complement of billions and billions of neurons, reaching out to each other, building connections with mind-boggling speed, nearly 2 million every second, until the brain has become a tightly packed network of trillions of crisscrossing wires, with more connections than stars in the sky.
You can imagine the size of the wiring problem. So how is that problem solved? How is that achieved during development? How is it that each one of those trillion connections is made appropriately?
You might think, oh, what a mess. It's just going to be a jumble of connections and wires all over the place. But in fact, the nervous system seems to have a strategy.
The strategy is in the genes. The brain begins to wire itself by following a precisely specified genetic blueprint.
The connections are following very defined rules. Go out of the eye, turn right at the optic chiasm, cross the chiasm, head toward the lateral geniculate nucleus, grow into the lateral geniculate nucleus. Don't grow into the medial geniculate nucleus because that's an auditory structure. So you can imagine the first stage of brain wiring is kind of like solving the problem of connecting phones in New York to phones in Boston. Making sure that you're making connections between Boston and New York and not Boston and Washington, D.C. And that's all specified genetically. Now then there's a second phase of brain wiring. Let's say you want to place a phone call to your grandmother in New York. And you want that phone to ring, on Park Avenue and 47th or whatever. And you don't want the phone to ring up at the Waldorf Astoria. Okay, how do you get that precise phone to ring? That's the second phase of brain wiring. If you place a phone call to your grandmother early in development, her phone will ring. But so will a lot of other phones. So there are a lot of connections that are made. If the connections are correct and being used, they get strengthened. If they're not being used, or they're only being used occasionally, they're lost. We could call it use it or lose it. So the fetal brain is really a dynamic structure that's constantly changing in response to this process of strengthening appropriate connections and pruning inappropriate connections. Getting the circuits all tuned up takes a long time. So it can't happen overnight because you have literally billions of connections to check. When a child is born prematurely, the process is only partly